is the President of American Atheists, with more than 15 years experiencing fighting for civil rights, civil liberties, and religious equality. Nick is a committed coalition builder, an advocate who works to ensure that atheists and non-religious people have their voices heard. As the President of American Atheists, Nick works to combat stigma, bias, discrimination, and to promote understanding of non-religious people. A native of Michigan, Nick studied political science before working at Raleigh, North Carolina, managing a voter outreach office that registered more than 5,000 voters and knocked on more than 25,000 doors in 2 months leading up to the 2008 election.
Wow.
Yes, wow. The CFFC is a proud affiliate of American Atheists. We are very thrilled to have Nick join us. He joined us at our tent yesterday and he marched with us. Thank you, Nick. Nick's talk will be on the fight to protect our rights from white Christian nationalist attacks on equality and how they are not going to be won by only focusing on courtroom battles or legislation in Washington, D.C. And we would consider Nick a friend. So please welcome Nick Fish.
Thanks so much. Thank you for a very warm welcome, and thank you everybody for your hospitality this weekend. It's been really fantastic to have some time to chat with everyone, to get to know you, to hang out with you at the Pride booth, and to march with you in the parade. As a LGBT person myself, it's really great to be a member of a community that is so unapologetic in standing up for all of our rights, and so I'm really pleased to be here and to, again, share with you that experience. I'm going to be talking, as Jocelyn said, a bit about white Christian nationalism. I know something that none of us know anything about, something I'm sure you've not heard any talks about, and is just a complete surprise to you. And I'm going to talk about how our community groups, how the folks on the ground are the true answer to this threat. As Jocelyn said, the bulk of my experience in this community has been working at the federal level, working with national organizations based in Washington, D.C., or with staff in Washington, D.C., working in the courtrooms and so on, trying to affect policy change at that level. But over the last 5 years in particular, it's becoming increasingly clear that the most urgent fights are not happening in Washington, D.C. They're not happening in Congress. They're happening in state houses. State houses in Tallahassee, in Austin, in Little Rock, Atlanta. They're also happening at school board meetings, city council meetings that are happening every single week in these communities. They're happening in our backyards, and no one in this country is immune from that. The difference is that these fights are not about tax rates, or funding for public transit, or whether we can build a new apartment building, partially about that, or about Social Security or Medicare. They're about book bans. They're about criminalizing healthcare for our LGBTQ friends and loved ones. They're about attacking the right for every individual to make a choice about when or if to start a family. And they're about destroying the very foundations of our nation's public education system. Increasingly, they're not even about that. They're about attacks on democracy themselves. And that's what I'm here to talk about, is how we can do something about it. Given the interconnectedness of our nation today, the nationalization of politics and media, the influence of major national figures on our local news and on our local culture and on our local institutions, and the ease of finding our tribe online through social media, the fact is that the political and cultural fights in Washington have now filtered down into our communities. And the fights in our communities have filtered up into Washington, D.C. These fights are polarizing us and in some cases radicalizing our neighbors against us. And that shouldn't really be a surprise. But this threat isn't just limited to our communities here in the United States as well. I was in Copenhagen recently this summer speaking with our colleagues and our friends and our allies, our family of the broader world humanist community, talking about the threat of white Christian nationalism in America and how it's being exported to their shores. These religious extremists and ideologues have found great success here in the US, but they're not satisfied with that. They're exporting their beliefs and their bigotry into the political systems of other nations. And it's an unfortunate fact that our failure here in the US to grapple with and fight back and stop the rise of white Christian nationalism is leading to a rise in religious nationalism and anti-democratic backsliding all across the world. It means that this rise in religious nationalism is putting all nations at risk. But before I dive in a little bit more to the historical context and to what we're doing, I want to start with a little bit of background about myself. I started this work, I came to do this work, like many of us do, after seeing my own rights being taken away from me. In 2004, I was able to vote for the first time. I apologize to anyone who that makes feel old. It is what it is. But as someone who was paying more attention to politics than any normal, reasonable 18-year-old should have been, I was way too excited to be able to vote in my first election, to cast a ballot in a presidential election. It was a very exciting time for me. For the people who may not remember that, for whichever reason, 20 years ago, that was the re-election campaign of George W. Bush. The United States had just invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, and despite initial public opinion strongly supporting both, President Bush's support was sort of waning. So in that election, his campaign, working to elect a middlingly popular president, needed a way to shore up its base. And that base that they turned to were evangelical Christians. They made the decision that the best way for them to motivate those people to vote, to create a wedge issue, was to target LGBTQ people. Using recent court decisions at the time in Hawaii and Massachusetts that expanded marriage equality to same-sex couples, they painted those expansions, those court-ordered expansions of marriage equality, as a threat, an existential threat to the sanctity of the marriages of heterosexuals. They said that it was an early movement toward secularization that was threatening to cause the United States to abandon its Christian heritage. Now, all of that was made up, a lie, whatever word you want to use, but they painted that extension of the institution of marriage to include people as somehow cheapening heterosexual marriages. And, perhaps most resonantly with certain groups of evangelicals and conservative Christians, they portrayed LGBTQ people as a threat to children. The echoes that we hear today of the previous use of religion to target LGBTQ people, particularly in the context of today's moral panics, is particularly hard to ignore, especially as it relates to trans people. But the mechanisms that they used then are very different from the mechanisms they're using today. In 2004, these bans were used at the ballot box. That's where they passed. Huge majorities in all 11 states that had marriage equality on the ballot said that same-sex couples should not be able to get married. It was a time when what some might call popular democracy was used to take away the rights of a vulnerable minority. In fact, it was a primary message that they used to reinforce the so-called righteousness of their cause. Who are these unelected judges to tell us, the God-fearing white American population, that we have to celebrate sin? That's what they would ask. And those appeals to populism and hostility to civil and human rights guardrails intended to protect the rights of vulnerable groups from the whims of the majority still resonate today. But the targets of those appeals to populism are no longer judges. Instead, they're other so-called cultural elites. They're woke corporations, they're teachers, they're librarians, they're doctors, they're universities, they're us. The system itself is captured, they say, by an entrenched deep state, hostile to the beliefs and preferences of real Americans. The language of their calls to action is often framed in explicitly religious terms. Fights between good and evil. Every issue and policy fight is an end times battle that has to be waged by spiritual warriors. We've been talking about the threat of white Christian nationalism in this community for quite some time now. The media and politicians are finally starting to recognize that and actually speaking about it themselves. But for those who don't know, those for whom this is your first meeting, maybe the first time you're hearing this term, let me tell you what it is. White Christian nationalism is the fusion of beliefs about what it means to be truly American. And in this vision of Americanness that they have, there are winners and losers. People who are chosen by God to rule, and those who are to be ruled. In the view of white Christian nationalists, one must adhere not just to Christianity, but to a particular form of conservative Christianity. It's a Christianity that is highly structured, authoritarian, advocates for so-called traditional gender norms and roles, and is intolerant of dissent and internal critique. It's a Christianity that values the accumulation of power for the sake of holding on to power. Beyond that, it's an ideology that is hostile to any form of multiculturalism or pluralism. It holds that long-standing racial hierarchies must also be preserved, that immigrants must assimilate to their vision of Americanness without lending any of their own historical cultural context to what it means to be American. That Black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans, especially if they aren't evangelical Christians, are inherently second-class citizens and can never be truly American. There's some really great writing out there about Christian nationalism, and I want to start with just mentioning one that I really value, which is Samuel Perry and Philip Gorski's book, The Flag and the Cross. And take a look at that if you can find it. It's a great book. A distinguishing feature of the political expression of white Christian nationalism is what they refer to as the holy trinity of freedom, order, and violence. Their freedom is a kind of libertarian freedom for people like us. And by us, I don't mean us. Us means, above all, straight, white, native-born, Christian men, period. Order is what's to be imposed on everyone else. Freedom for thee, or freedom for me, order for thee. It means preserving racial and gender order above all else. And violence, the last bit of the Trinity, is a righteous violence that is to be directed against anyone who violates that order. This is a sort of political ideology that uses Christian narratives and symbolism and illusion to great effect. It's what we see today, where overwhelming majorities of Donald Trump supporters identify as Christians but do not step foot in a church. Where they identify as political Christians, not as theological Christians, papering over vast differences in theology. But crucially, this ideology is antithetical to our understanding of democracy and our values as humanists. And rather than attempting to convince voters that their positions are the right ones, white Christian nationalism has its own version of the elect, meaning those chosen by God. And only the elect should control the political process. They don't need to convince us, because our vote doesn't count. They want to control the entire political process, lest the people who are not like them gain access to power. Those others, they believe, must be closely scrutinized, discouraged, and even denied access to the political system. Supporters of this ideology are fundamentally a threat to a pluralistic democratic society. They are far less likely to say that we should make it easier for people to vote. They're far more likely to support racial and political gerrymandering. And they're far more likely to have supported and still support attempts to overturn the election in 2020 and to believe that the election was stolen. And they're far more likely to support those claims through violence. And while white Christian nationalist politics is ascendant in America and in Florida, we can't pretend that this is some recent development. To summarize, another great expert that you should look into and read some books from, Andrew Whitehead, Christian nationalism and anti-democratic attitudes have a long history in this country. After the American Civil War in the 1960s, through the years of Jim Crow and into the Civil Rights era and beyond, white Christian leaders have provided a sort of theological justification to rationalize limiting Black Americans' access to participation in the democratic process. They explicitly tied these efforts to their desire to protect the so-called purity of our Christian nation. These have not been and are not now simply policy disagreements. These are attempts to limit voting access, ranging from administrative barriers making it harder to vote, to threats of political violence used to disrupt the democratic process and shill participation. The anti-democratic goals and actions are not secret. They're not hidden from public view or only whispered about in back rooms. In a 1980 speech to a group of evangelical leaders, Paul Weyrich, the co-founder of the Christian nationalist group The Moral Majority, said this, I'm going to quote here. "Now, many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome, good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up, as the voting populace goes down." Clear as day. The more people who vote, the less power they have. For decades, Christian nationalists who have focused on gaining and maintaining power have been aware that a democracy with free and fair elections threatens the ability of white, culturally conservative Christians to maintain their privileged access to the levers of political power. And their response was both obvious and consistent. Make it difficult or impossible for the political opposition, inevitably racial, religious, ethnic minorities, to vote. Weyrich and Jerry Falwell and all of their allies worked to create organizations to write and then enact policies necessary to bring Christian nationalism's anti-democratic vision into being. Many of these groups still exist today, with a slight veneer of respectability, but barely removed from their racist and theocratic origins. And they support restrictive voter policies that disproportionately target voters of color, including things like strict voter ID laws, automatic removal of voters from registration lists, and severely limiting the number of polling places. But having successfully enacted many of those restrictive voting laws and comprehensive gerrymandering and all of the policies they could dream up to choke off who had access to voting, now they've pivoted. They're working on a new strategy, weaponizing identity, demonizing LGBTQ people, criminalizing abortion, and attacking public education. They've done this largely through a campaign that they themselves called Project Blitz. Apparently, Project Destroy All of Your Rights wasn't quite threatening enough, so they went with like one step below. The stated goal of Project Blitz was to overwhelm state legislatures with bills based on centrally manufactured legislation from these groups. One of the movement's founders, David Barton of Wall Builders fame, said, quote, "It's kind of like a whack-a-mole on the other side. It'll drive them crazy that they'll have to divide their resources out in opposing this." And he was right. In just the past 5 years, American Atheists has gone from tracking 70 bills affiliated with Project Blitz in 2018 to tracking more than 500 last year. These bills often start small and symbolic, acknowledgments of the American national motto, "In God We Trust," putting them on every conceivable flat surface owned by the government possible, school classrooms, city halls, courtrooms, police cars, park benches, whatever. But from there, they use that to build on new laws and encourage state legislatures to designate some month the Biblical History Month, or the entire year, the year of the Bible. Now you might be asking, well, wait a second, which Bible? There's a lot of them. But that's not important, forget about it. They sort of transition, they do a sleight of hand, going from a general promotion of religion as some sort of squishy public good to this specific promotion of their version of Christianity as inherently American. But their ultimate goal is the policymaking that we're living in today, that you all are living in Florida today. Their goal was to enact laws that put the lives of LGBTQ people under threat. One piece of legislation that they pointed to as a model, all the way back in 2016, so long ago, would have allowed private businesses and government employees to discriminate against LGBTQ people primarily, provided that they do so in accordance with a sincerely held religious belief. The bill offers extraordinary protections, not to all religious beliefs per se, but to a very narrow set of beliefs associated almost entirely with conservative white Christian theology. If you hold a different set of beliefs, for example, a commitment to gender and LGBTQ equality or to abortion access, there's no liberty here for you. In another piece of model legislation, their goal was to have state legislatures resolve that, notwithstanding the Supreme Court's decision in 2015 protecting same-sex marriage, that, quote, this state supports and encourages marriage between one man and one woman, and the desirability that intimate sexual relations only take place between such couples. That was what they wrote. As we know, Christian nationalists are absolutely obsessed with what goes on in other people's bedrooms. But the sheer cruelty and bigotry of their beliefs is really laid bare in the justification that they wrote for the law. The bill claims that people in same-sex relationships have a, quote, higher instance of serious disease, and that gay sex is costing taxpayers untold amounts of money, quote, estimated to be in the billions of dollars annually. According, that's in the bill template. Curious where they got that math, but that's okay. So why have I talked so long about the background, the historical background of this, the successes of their anti-democratic, anti-humanist, anti-pluralistic movement? Well, ultimately, it's because the groups advancing this agenda are not satisfied with the things they've already won. Instead, they're looking right now at how to roll back our rights and our progress even further, using tens and indeed hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars. They've already entrenched sympathetic judges on the federal bench, solidifying a Christian nationalist majority on the Supreme Court for decades to come, and indeed a supermajority in the foreseeable future. They have poured piles of money into astroturfed groups aimed at empowering extremists in our own backyards. They know that their ideology is deeply unpopular and opposed by the overwhelming majority of Americans. They know that they're losing their power. They're losing their demographic edge, and that the time of their privilege and their wielding of power is coming to an end. What we're in right now are the death rattles of a dying movement. But if they can use that last bit of power to enact anti-democratic policies that insulate them from electoral accountability, gerrymandering state legislatures, taking power away from local governments after they've gerrymandered those state races, they can maintain their power for just a little bit longer. And in that time, the most vulnerable among us are going to be paying the price. To give you an idea of the scope of this problem, ProPublica recently released a story exposing the ideology and exploring the funding of Leonard Leo, the head of the group, the Federalist Society, and the man who is primarily responsible for a decades-long campaign to remake our federal judiciary. I want to read sort of an extended quote from that. Having reshaped the courts, Leo now has grander ambitions. Today, he sees a nation plagued with ills: wokeism in education, one-sided journalism, and ideas like environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, policies sweeping corporate America. A member of the Roman Catholic Church, he intends to wage a broader cultural war against a progressive Ku Klux Klan, quote, and, quote, vile and immoral current-day barbarians, secularists, and bigots, end quote, who demonize people of faith and move society further from its, quote, natural order, end quote. And Leo has a $1.6 billion war chest to enact his plan. Reclusive billionaire donated $1.6 billion to Leonard Leo that is now sitting in a nonprofit for him to do with what he wants. Last year, Moms for Liberty, a so-called parents' rights group, endorsed more than 500 candidates for school board races. About half of their candidates won. And in the school districts that they won, they got to work. Despite repeated protestations that they weren't banning books and they weren't threatening LGBTQ teachers who merely mentioned that they had a spouse, they did exactly that. A report released last month by PEN America ranked Florida as the leader in book bans, surpassing Texas. They've removed books written by Toni Morrison and Kurt Vonnegut, and even a poem written by Amanda Gorman that was read at Joe Biden's inauguration in 2021. In Alabama, they flagged a book called Read Me a Story, Stella, about a girl teaching her younger brother to read as potentially explicit. Why? Because the author's last name was gay.
Oh, jeez.
And according to the Miami Herald, in more than 150 school districts, in the 150 school districts that banned a book during the 22-23 school year here in Florida, the vast majority, 80%, have a chapter or local affiliate nearby of one of three groups that have been pushing book bans: Moms for Liberty, Citizens Defending Freedom, and Parents' Rights in Education. Our opponents know that the power of these ostensibly local groups is that they can launder $1 billion slush fund from Leonard Leo and his allies. They can give the appearance of popular backlash, but it's nothing of the sort. These are extremists that have deeply unpopular views, deeply unpopular actions that are projecting their views on the rest of us. An analysis by the Washington Post showed just how out of step, how extreme, and how small of a group of people we're talking about here. They found that just 11 people were responsible for 60% of all book bans nationwide. So what's the answer to this assault on public schools, on our LGBTQ friends and loved ones, on abortion access, and on democracy itself? How can we possibly fight back against a movement that has billions of dollars, has a network, albeit a small network, but a network of obsessive extremists, and has the support, and this is kind of critical, of many churches and religious leaders dotted all over every single state in communities all across the country? But the answer is right here in front of us. It's this group. It's groups just like this all over the country. While I'm sorry to say that American atheists and the broader non-religious movement and our civil rights allies don't have any eccentric billionaires that are dropping $1.6 billion on us to help us remake American culture, we don't necessarily need that. Although, if you do know anyone, I will put the website up later. Okay? We will share it. Like I don't even need to be the one in charge. All right, we will make do with maybe half that. All right. So if you know anybody, just let me know. But what we do have are real people, a genuine grassroots community all across this country that the majority of Americans agree with. They are on our side. We are no longer the people that are subject to popular rejection in the same way that we once were. We have thriving, vibrant, diverse groups of people who are standing against extremism and building bridges, and this is crucial, to other people of conscience. Religious people, non-religious people, LGBTQ people, abortion advocates, environmental advocates, all of that. To people who share our values as humanists, as people deeply committed to democracy. By unapologetically living our values out loud and in our communities like you all are, by being here, like you did if you came to Pride yesterday, by participating in civic culture, we are showing that the scaremongering and bigotry of white Christian nationalism does not hold water. We're showing our neighbors that the claims of their religious leaders that secularization is going to lead to the downfall of society is just a tiny bit overstated. We're showing that you can live a healthy, thriving, amazing life by relying on people you love and cherish and care about in a community that has nothing to do with shared religious belief. That it comes from the personal connections that we make to one another, relying on each other to get through the tough days and to celebrate the good ones. We're demonstrating that an inclusive, pluralistic vision of American values is the only way for a nation of almost 350 million people to truly thrive. And so, after being sort of a Debbie Downer here for, like 20 minutes talking, I suppose I should end on somewhat of a hopeful note, or if maybe not hopeful, maybe aspirational, purposeful, we'll call it. It's our obligation as humanists, as community leaders, as Americans committed to democracy, to properly frame the existential threat of our democracy that white Christian nationalist ideology poses to a functioning society. Their belief in a supremacy of religion over non-religion, of one particular religion over all other religions, strikes at the very heart of the foundation of our beliefs in this community and in our belief in universal human rights. The struggle is not atheists against the religious, humanists against Christian, progressive against conservative, white against black, gay against straight. It's a struggle between an exclusionary, divisive, and dangerous ideology against all those who would dare question it. And it's incumbent upon us to speak out forcefully against the cruel, dehumanizing rhetoric and policies of the Christian nationalist movement. And I want to pause for a second and say that atheists are not immune from this. That there are atheists and humanists, well, probably not humanists, but atheists, maybe people who would call themselves humanists, who use the same dehumanizing, dangerous rhetoric, calling people groomers, saying that gender-affirming care is child abuse. The "oh, won't someone please think of the children" style rhetoric that creates a permission structure for people to engage in violence against doctors. It prompts people to call in bomb threats to hospitals. It prompts the evacuation of theme parks having an LGBTQ night, or that prompts schools to have to evacuate because someone calls in a threat because a local LGBTQ group is meeting. Or that causes teachers to fear for their lives and leave the profession entirely. That causes librarians to worry that they'll be subjected to ruinous lawsuits simply because they didn't cave to some extremist who wanted the removal of a Toni Morrison book from their shelves. We need to build bridges to people, to groups, to communities that share our vision, that share our value of a pluralistic society, where all people have the freedom to believe or not believe as they see fit. We have to fight and be ready to fight, sometimes literally, to protect the safety and human dignity of all people, but especially our LGBTQ siblings, people who need access to abortion care, immigrants, and others. And that's the work that can only be done in communities, on the ground. That's the work that's being done every day by the volunteers, the leaders, the members of groups like yours. And that's what I, as a leader in a national organization, am eternally grateful for. Democratic backsliding is enabled by a campaign of dehumanization that is being waged against disfavored minority groups. It's far easier for them, as I said, to justify extreme actions when they believe that children are under attack or that their core being is under threat. And it's important to recognize that this campaign will not end with mere obstacles to voting or to book bans or to anything in the legislature. Violence against disfavored groups is on the agenda, and it's already happening. Government officials in some states are demanding lists of patients who have received medical care related to gender transition or related to abortion. Parents are being threatened with the removal of their children. And we've seen mass shootings motivated explicitly by white Christian nationalist ideology targeting Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue, black Christian worshipers in Charlottesville, black shoppers in Buffalo, New York. We've seen religious and ethno-nationalism be used as a justification for violence, not just in the United States, but in Norway, in New Zealand, and all over the world. The violence and the rhetoric that enables it must be forcefully condemned. Groups within our community with the resources to engage in advocacy must act now to support grassroots advocacy and community building, promote engagement in civic culture, and work to strengthen guardrails that protect universal human rights and promote pluralism and mutual respect. And that's something that we need to step up and do. We, American Atheists, we, Freedom from Religion Foundation, AHA, to help you, because so much of that work is happening here on the ground. We can work to build coalitions with other faith and belief groups, collaborate where we find common ground, and ensure that we are communicating about this threat strategically in a way that promotes understanding rather than alienating potential allies. We have to be thoughtful and compassionate in our criticism and in our rhetoric, and make sure that we're not playing into or allowing ourselves to be used as tools of xenophobes, reactionaries, and bigots. And while it's true that the courts have long been a tool for us here in the US to vindicate our rights and protect the most vulnerable, including victories here in Florida, my view is that we can no longer rely on them as good faith arbiters of the law or protectors of human rights and human dignity. They have been taken over and packed by the very same ideologues that we are now forced to confront. Instead, we have to commit ourselves to making our arguments in the court of public opinion, showing the harms that come from privileging of any one religion over another, or of allowing the powers of the state to be wielded against dissenters. But we have to do so without appealing to the populist instincts of so many politicians. There are 95,000 school board members elected across this country, 7,000 state legislators, and almost 500,000 total elected officials in this country. Running for office, engaging in the difficult work, making of the sausage of the political process, expanding access to voting, supporting candidates who share our values and share our commitment to democracy puts us into stark contrast with our opponents. But it's work that has to be done. And it's work that can only be done here in our local communities. This is, and I won't pretend for 1 second, that this is an easy path for us to follow. There is no cosmic force bending the moral arc of the universe toward justice. The slow, steady march of progress can only continue when advocates like us and communities like this unapologetically insist on humanist values. Our commitment to human dignity, to freedom of thought, to equality, to justice, and to compassion. And we have to advocate that those are the best way to protect the rights of us all. Thank you.
Would you say that what can be done on a local level and state level can act as a counterbalance or as a bulwark to the power of the U.S. Supreme Court, and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court members will change, even though it might be decades?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so one thing that I want to highlight that is sort of unique in our community is a lot of the groups, the national groups in particular, the sort of emergence of organized atheist humanist groups didn't really start until, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, a little bit. Like that was sort of when things were getting kicked off. There obviously were some other groups that predate that. The American Humanist Association, I know, dates back to the 1940s. The American Atheists was 1963. But the time when, the crucial point here is the time when a lot of these groups were emerging was sort of an aberration in American political history, or American legal history, where the Supreme Court was, for once, a force for good. The Supreme Court was being used as a vehicle to advance civil rights. It was like 25 years where this happened. Every other time in American history, the Supreme Court has served as this anti-democratic check on, minorities gaining too much power too quickly, or, actually it's fine that a 12-year-old is working in a cotton, with a cotton gin, or that, we have a 14-year-old working in a smelting plant. And we really can't regulate that. Like that was the sort of thing the Supreme Court was ruling on for years. There are a ton of mechanisms to rein in this court, to point to the court and say we should not give them, these are not priests from on high telling us what the law is. They are political actors, they always have been political actors. We have to recognize this as part of the political process and treat them as such. These are not sages giving us wisdom from on high. And so some ways of doing that, we've endorsed various pieces of legislation out there that would enact ethics reform for the Supreme Court so that we don't have Supreme Court justices being literally flown around, being bribed by billionaires, to come up with creative ways to do term limits, either by requiring sort of every other year a justice is appointed to the court, and then the other ones are required to take senior status, but they're still appointed, but you only have the 9 newest people on panels, or whatever it might be, but come up with creative ways to try to rein in their power. The other thing that we can do is look to other countries, and this is something that I think we as Americans are a little hesitant to do often. It's like, well, this is the way it's done in America, and it must be the right way. But a lot of other countries, In the UK, for example, and I don't think any of us think the United Kingdom is an apocalyptic hellscape with no civil rights, they don't have a First Amendment in the same way that we do, so good on us. But at the same time, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom cannot strike down what's called primary legislation. They are not able to look to legislation and say, nope, you can't do that, because Parliament has the ultimate authority in the UK. Here, we have judicial supremacy, where the courts get the final word. That was just sort of created. It's not the only way of doing it. Is it the best way? I don't know. We need to seriously consider some of this. But part of it is democratic reform, making sure that our democratic institutions are responsive so that people, when they're voting, see a difference. Because as it is, people are so disillusioned with their government, they don't see changes actually happening because our system is so paralyzed, especially at the federal level. The people look to that and go, well, what the hell difference does it make if I vote for this guy or this guy, if they've got this letter after their name or this letter? It doesn't matter because nothing ever changes. What I'll tell you is that is definitely not the case in your states. That at the state, in the local, in the community level, the people we elect make a huge difference. And they are the people with the most direct impact on our everyday rights. That as it currently stands, the federal government will pass anywhere between 2 or 3 big pieces of legislation every year. That's it, that's all that gets done. And then they name a bunch of courthouses and try desperately to elect a speaker 17 times, right? That's what's happening at the federal level right now, but in states, that's where everything's getting done. And we have to remember there are 51 different devolved legislatures in the United States, plus Puerto Rico, where we have the opportunity to not just stop terrible things from happening, which is what we're trying to do in many of these states, but we actually have an opportunity to innovate and try new things and expand our democratic processes. Open up our society, our civic society, to new people who have never had a voice. And so what I would advocate for is a robust embracing of democracy. Yes, democracy with guardrails to prevent quote-unquote mob rule, protecting human rights, but sometimes we win elections and sometimes we lose elections. But if we lose an election, then people will see what happened and go, oh, I didn't really like that. And so let's do something different next time. Because as it stands currently, the other side will often say, well, we wanted to throw all these groomers into jail, but the damn courts wouldn't let us. And so they're not playing with real stakes, they're sort of pretending. It's a lot of making mouth noises without ever actually, they're never able to actually do anything. But the moment that, for example, Roe was struck down, people started to see the horrible, awful effects of this ideology put into practice. And I don't want to pretend for one moment that excuses or that I'm okay with the harm, the devastating effects that these abortion bans have on people. But I will say that now people are seeing, oh my gosh, this is atrocious. And it's causing them to bleed support because now people see exactly what it means when you say life begins at conception, right? And so democracy means that sometimes we lose. It means that we have to put up guardrails, but we should advocate for a democracy that is actually responsive, that people feel heard, that people are heard, that people have an opportunity to actually affect their lives and create policy that makes a difference. So what I would say as far as the Supremes making policy or not, we need to advocate for democracy. And the way that it's working right now ain't it. And I don't have the perfect solution, I don't think anyone does, but clearly what's happening right now is not working. And so we should be creative and look to other examples. So I'll kind of leave it there as a fitting answer.
AstroTurf is a term not everybody might know.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So astroturfing, if you're not familiar with it, comes from grassroots, right? So you mean the people who are at the ground level, working day to day, local level. That's your grassroots. That term was created. AstroTurfing was created because it means fake grass, right? And so it's where you have billionaires and huge corporate interests and really far out there horrible bigots being like, here's $1 million to you 3 people. I want you to fake having popular support. It's what Moms for Liberty is 10 people, right? The Million Moms March that whined about, that continually whines about, interracial things on TV or same-sex couples on TV or whatever it is. It's literally some guy in his basement, right? These are fake groups that have the veneer of grassroots, but it's fake. That's what astroturfing is. So if you've never heard that term.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned that the trend in demographic groups is such that it's more or less likely that a more democratic process, more democratic government will eventually result. But I've also observed that in recent history, at least the past 100 years or so, when things get tough economically, people tend to become more conservative.
Yeah, and so, you know, I'll say that it's not that people go conservative, it's that people become reactionary. There's nothing inherently conservative about that idea. Like, if we define conservatism to mean, things are pretty good, like, let's not rock the boat too much, you know, sure. But, you know, I think most conservatives, and especially reasonable conservatives that I've spoken to, who genuinely look at the Constitution and say, you know, listen, local control is better, we don't want the federal, we want to limit the role of the federal government, fine. You know, we want lower taxes, fewer social services. Like, that's a debate I would be more than happy to have. You know, like, and is that maybe beyond my scope as President of American Atheists? Yes. But that's not what we're debating right now. What we're debating right now is whether a cabal of LGBTQ people are grooming children into neo-Marxism. Like, it's just so unhinged that they're looking for someone to blame. And that's where the economic stuff kind of comes in, is that what we have to do, and this goes back to what I was talking about a minute ago, we have to create systems that are resilient, where people feel heard, and that are taking care of people. Because what's happening is people are not feeling heard. They're feeling that those people over there are getting some benefit, and I don't like it, because I feel like I'm not being taken care of, that I don't have access to the same privileges, right? And they're looking for someone to blame for that. And these movements are very successful in giving them someone to blame. Often it's atheists, often it's black folks, often it's LGBTQ people, often it's Jews, right? Like, and in some cases in this country, it's been Muslims, right? Where people will write into us and say, well, why aren't you dealing with this tremendous threat that Sharia law is posing to the United States? It's like, do you know that like Muslims are like 0.5% of the American population? Or, you know, that people think Jews are controlling the world or whatever. It's like, you mean the less than 1% of the population that are Jewish are controlled? What? Like, they're looking for someone to blame because they can't imagine that the system they're in is the problem. And so what we have to do as community groups is create accountability, create sort of an upswell of responsive government, holding them accountable to our values, demanding better from our local governments, so that people can see, oh, wait a second, there is a way forward here that isn't that we need to blame these people over here. And so I don't think it's inevitable, and I do want to say, I don't want to pretend, and I don't want to ever give the impression that anything is demographically inevitable. There are trends, but nothing is written in stone. There is no, I am not in the business of soothsaying or fortune telling or future telling or any of that. I can tell you that yes, the number of non-religious people has gone up in this country. I can tell you that at the same time, however, many of those people are just completely disengaging from civic culture. They're leaving groups in general. They're not interested in being part of any civic society, any civic group. They're saying they're so frustrated, they're so apathetic because they're not seeing a government that works for them, a society that works for them, that they just disengage. And we have to build something better for those folks. Now, the people in this room are part of the solution to that. And some of you, may have had those feelings as well. I know that I have in my life as well. It's like, I don't need to join anything, like I'm fine. And then something happens, right, in your life where it's like, man, I really wish I had somebody to lean on right now. I really wish, somebody would bring me a casserole. I'm from the Midwest, so it would be a casserole topped with tater tots. I don't know what it is here, but something similar. And like that's a role that in some countries government plays. In our country, a lot of churches had played it traditionally. And so we kind of neglected social safety net programs, things like that, because the idea was either intentionally or through sort of a failure of imagination, the churches have this. Well, that doesn't work in a country with 350 million people, with like 2,000 different religious denominations and a third of the population being non-religious. That doesn't work anymore. So we need to do something different. And we have to provide that alternative. We have to really push back on these attempts to clamp down on democratic participation, really be unapologetic advocates for democracy. And again, democracy is not just simple rule by the majority. It's agreeing to a set of ground rules. It's protecting universal human rights. It's making sure that the rights of minority groups are not subject to an up or down vote by people that despise them, right? So there are guardrails to put in place, and that's really important, but it means an accountable, responsive government that sometimes you win an election and sometimes you lose an election, but it's not, we're not dealing with, we're going to be locking up our opponents, because I mean, in some cases that's literally what they're talking about, right? So. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, hello.
Hi.
I was really excited to see particularly a lot of people showed up, very urban Orlando, but I live in DeBerry. It has about 20,000 people, a very rural part. What could we do in the meantime trying to fight that rural power? Because rural people do have this disproportionate amount of power in this country.
Yeah.
How do we fight that?
Yeah, so one really good point you sort of ended on there that I think is important is, again, if we're not sort of looking at the structures of how our government works in this country, one of the things that's key is that rural parts of this country are disproportionately overrepresented, especially in the Senate, but even in the House. Even in some states, where they can gerrymander things, where you have counties that, you've all these county governments that can do whatever they want in places where, I'm from a town that had 9,000, has a population of 9,000. Okay, I will tell you in 2004, when our state was put an anti-gay marriage, same-sex marriage constitutional amendment on, and it only had to pass with 50% plus one of the vote to take away my rights. Thank you. That we had a rally in my hometown, and we had hundreds of people show up. And this was in 2004, right? And so part of it is communicating with shared values, turning down the temperature on this so people know that we're talking in sort of shared language. We all want what's best for our kids. We all want to be able to live our lives. We all want to be able to, marry the people we love or share our lives with the people we love. If you're not a marriage person, that's fine. We want to share our lives with people that we care about. And that doesn't just mean marriage, that means sharing our lives with the people in this room that we care about, the people that, we're in community with. And that there's a lot of overlap there. And so that would be sort of number one, is talk about values. Number two is, we have to have events, we have to go out, we have to be visible in every single community in this country, because so many people do live in rural communities that we can't, as people who, I live in Philadelphia, those of you who live in Orlando, in the city, and not in the surrounding counties, we can't hunker down and pretend that this isn't going to come knocking on our door. I think that's when you're talking with folks who are, in a more urban setting or who live in big cities, we have to disabuse people of the notion of well, that's never going to happen here. Anytime I'm talking, I don't need to tell you all this because you guys are living this every day. But when I go talk to a group in New Jersey, or I talk to a group in New York City, or I talk to a group in Washington, and they say, well, why, we should just saw off the Florida and let it float into the sea. And they say things like that, and we laugh because it's come on. But they'll say things like, well, this is what Texas gets for voting for those people, right? Well, that's what Florida gets for voting for those people. It's well, Florida didn't vote for these people, right? Some of them did, but a lot of people were either forced out of the election through no fault of their own. The state of Florida enacted voting reform to allow people who were disenfranchised, felony disenfranchisement, got people back on the voter rolls, and then they said, nope, not happening, actually, just kidding, we're not going to do that, right? And so this is a state with a democracy problem, and so the blaming people who, in Texas, who were freezing to death because their state didn't invest in their grid, and saying, well, that's what you get for electing those people. That is the most cruel, dehumanizing thing you can say to a person that pushes them into the corner and says, well, I'm not going to side with you if that's what you're going to have that sort of rhetoric to me, right? The people who are victimized by state legislatures in these states are the people who live in these states. And the people who think they're safe in Philadelphia or New York or in Washington, D.C. or whatever it may be, they're wrong. Because what ends up happening is it's a talent pipeline for the other side, where they get people elected to the school board to enact their will there, then they get promoted and get elected to the city council, and then the county commissioners, and then they're a state legislator, and then they get pulled into the House. And suddenly they're knocking off the Speaker of the House, cough Matt Gaetz, right? Like, this is somebody, like, look at Matt Gaetz. He's somebody who plays such an outsized role in American politics, and who the heck is Matt Gaetz? Who the heck is that guy, right? And so when I talked about like the dirty, messy work, or like the sausage making of politics, getting involved in the political process, I always tell people always, I can't possibly run for office. Oh my God, could you imagine me? I'm not qualified, or I couldn't do it. Matt Gaetz is a member of Congress. You know, like have you seen some of the people who are in Congress? Have you seen some of the people who are in state legislature, right? And if you think that you can't do it, you're wrong. And we need to be willing to get our hands dirty. We need to be willing to, compromise sometimes, get in that really, like, come down from our tower, our idealism. Sometimes there's some horse trading that goes on and it sucks. But I do believe that a better future, a better way forward is possible, but it's messy and it's going to take a long time. And it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to suck for the people that are living in those communities, that are alienating you, that are explicitly telling you you're not welcome here, and that it's not possible for us to just pull up our tent stakes and move into cities. Like that's a non-starter for me. We need to meet people where they are, we need to talk about shared values, and we need to show them that a better way is possible through what we're talking about with religious pluralism, commitment to democracy. So I hope that sort of answered the question.
You painted a great picture about white Christian nationalists, male, straight, powerful people that have always felt that they themselves are the source of power and that not everybody else should have similar rights. But I saw something recently that really kind of made the little light bulb pop off in my head, which was these guys think that if other groups get rights, the people that previously were oppressed by them are going to want to punish them back. And we don't get, why are these guys so resistant to giving rights to other people? So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this retribution concept, because I think you need to understand.
So I encourage, there's some really great writing about the retributive nature of Christian nationalism, the ideology that underpins it, and the theology there that, if you smack me, I'm going to smack you back style of work, or style of theology that they have, that they genuinely believe that when the shoe is on the other foot, that we're going to exact revenge on them by carrying out the same sort of campaign of terror that they carried out on us. And no matter how many times we say, no, that, like, here's our values, they don't believe it, right? Because they can't imagine a world where you wouldn't do that. Because that's what they would do, right? So when they talk about, these liberals, these progressives, these atheists must be indoctrinating children in our schools. And so we're going to put a stop to that by indoctrinating children into our religion. And so they can't imagine for one moment that secularism, that the idea that government can just stay silent on religion. They think that, and you don't need to look to the superintendent of schools in Oklahoma to see this, where he said that secularism is atheist indoctrination in public schools. Because he genuinely believes that we would do the exact same thing he wants to do if we could. But it's simply not true. And what we have to do, the only way forward on that, is we have to say it over and over and over again, and then resist that very human urge to smack people back when they smack us, right? To be really cognizant of our own values, to make sure that we aren't trying to exact revenge, to make sure that we are laying guardrails and we're being consistent, that we are being good, upstanding, moral people, that we are using our power when we get it in an inclusive way, in a pluralistic way, which doesn't mean, by the way, that we're going to agree on everything. That's not what pluralism means. It means we agree on a few ground rules. It means that you got to play by those rules, but that we are going to disagree, and that's fine. And that, yes, we're going to have pitched battles sometimes on these disagreements. But at the end of the day, we all have to live in this space with one another. This space being defined as this room, being defined as this city, being defined as this county, this state, this country. And that pluralism means that we all buy into this idea that sometimes we win and sometimes we lose, but we're going to keep fighting, we're going to keep coming back, but at the end of the day, we're all in this together. And they just have to hear that over and over again, and then again, we have to live it. But there's only so much we can do because, again, a very core part of their identity is this retributive nature of their ideology, and we have to just work slowly to kind of almost like deprogram people, which is literally a really gross way of saying that, but we need to work to show them that that's not what's going to happen, and just talk openly, consistently, unapologetically about our values, and then live up to them. And we're not always going to do that, we're not always going to be perfect at that, we're going to fail, we're going to fall short sometimes, but we have to show them that we keep striving and be honest with ourselves of when we fail and when we fall short. So that would be the...
Hi, I wanted to ask about the difficulty in getting out the vote among the non-religious, the growing non-religious population, and is the solution at the grassroots level? Is it at politicians not reaching out and showing, like how can we do better and who needs to do better on this?
Yeah, so two things about that. The non-religious, so this is a complicated topic. So we have atheists, we have agnostics, we have people who sort of affirmatively claim a non-religious identity, right? And then we have people that check the none of the above box. And demographers will often lump us all together, right? So if you look at atheists, you look at people who self-identify as atheists and agnostics, single most politically engaged demographic in the country. Period. Like, not even close. So atheists, people who do not believe in God, people who affirmatively identify as atheists and agnostics, make up something like less than 10% of the population, like 8 to 10 depending on how you count it, but are something like 25% more likely to attend a rally, a protest, volunteer for a candidate. They're like twice as likely to donate to a candidate. I mean, it's like the numbers are startlingly huge. We're more engaged than evangelical Christians are, by far. And so that's atheists and agnostics, right? Then you've got none of the above, okay? And the none of the above is where the numbers really drop off. And kind of the open question, and something that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, that I think a lot of us that are thinking about political power are thinking about, is, okay, is it because they're so disengaged, they're not part of any civic organization? Is it because they were so frustrated with religious structures? They said, all these people are corrupt, all these people are hypocrites. I mean, that's like an overwhelming thing that we hear from the 15 to 20% of Americans who are just none of the above, but aren't themselves affirmative atheists, agnostics, non-religious people. The none of the above, they just disengage because they're like, everybody is corrupt, everybody's a hypocrite, none of these people have my best interests in mind. Nobody, anywhere. Anybody who's leading any sort of institution, I don't trust. So they stop trusting every institution. So why would they vote, right? They think, and in some cases they're right, that politicians are corrupt, that they aren't working for the betterment of their communities, right? And so it's what I've been talking about a commitment to democracy, a commitment to improving our democratic systems, a commitment to living unapologetically as non-religious people, as showing them that there is a better community that isn't full of hypocrites and bigots, where we can come together and just hang out and you don't have to worry about being preached at or proselytized to, and I mean that in the most general terms, that you can just hang out and have a Friendsgiving, or that you can just hang out and do some knitting while griping about your day, right? That there is a way to do that you don't have to pay the price of admission of holding your nose for a bunch of hypocrites, that you don't have to hold your nose at covering up of child abuse or sex abuse or whatever. And so that means, again, being unapologetic, being vocal, being loud about our values, holding ourselves accountable to those values, making sure that we're creating welcoming communities that live up to those values, setting clear expectations for what those values are, and when somebody transgresses those, you give them a shot to shape up and fly right, or you say, listen, we're not gatekeeping you being an atheist, but our community, these are expectations, you're not living up to it. So thank you, but no thanks, right? Because every community has that problem, right? It's like, oh, we don't want to kick anyone out. It's like, well, this person's making it actively suck to be in this group because they're dominating conversations, they're sexually harassing people. I'm not going to keep that guy who's a dick and exclude all these people who he's harassing. That's the choice. And so, when you're talking about building strong communities, I think that's a big part. How do we engage people is live those values, be really unapologetic about it, and encourage people to start their own thing. If it's not working for them, that's fine. But it's a lot of that. As far as getting those people out to vote, I think we again have to show people that their vote matters, that their vote is going to make a difference, And part of that is renewing a commitment to democracy at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. Thank you.